She braced for pain, for punishment, for humiliation. Instead, the American crouched beside her, gently holding the torn fabric in calloused hands, and muttered, "Don't worry, ma'am, just making sure you're all right." Yuko's voice caught in her throat. The tall man before her, dusty boots, a sun-scorched hat, spurs clicking, had just ripped open the seam of her dress. She had stumbled, catching it on a nail in the mess hall floor. She gasped, trembling, thinking it was the beginning of the cruelty she had been warned about. She screamed, "Please don't hurt me!" Her words rang across the barracks like a slap. But the cowboy only frowned, pulled a clean rag from his satchel, and knelt down beside her scraped knee. The cloth was cool against her skin, the wound shallow, the silence deeper. This was not the enemy she'd imagined. In the warm smell of tobacco and old leather, the world she knew began to crumble. It was only a torn dress. But to her, it was the first tear in an entire belief system. The camp announced itself not with shouting, but with order. Barbed wire cut clean lines across the Philippine heat, shimmering faintly under a white sun. The truck stopped, engines ticking as they cooled, and the women were told to step down. Yuko's legs nearly buckled when her boots hit the dirt. Around her, other Japanese women moved stiffly, shoulders drawn inward, eyes fixed on the ground. No one spoke. They had been taught that the moment of capture was the moment dignity died. Everything after was supposed to be worse. She smelled dust, sweat, and something unfamiliar drifting from deeper inside the camp. Coffee, perhaps, or meat. Her stomach tightened at the thought. Hunger had become a constant ache, a background noise of the war, but fear drowned it out now. She expected blows, expected shouting, expected hands that grabbed too tightly, and laughter that cut deeper than knives. Instead, there were gestures, a finger pointing where to stand, a clipboard lifted, then lowered, names asked for, mispronounced, written down anyway. Yuko had been a nurse since she was barely more than a girl. The army hospital had taught her efficiency, obedience, and silence. Pain was normal, mercy was not. From childhood, Bushido had been threaded into her bones. To endure without complaint was virtue. To surrender was disgrace. She remembered kneeling during training, repeating the words she barely understood at the time but had carried ever since. Better to die than to be captured. Her mother had nodded when she left for service, pride stiffening her thin smile. There had been no room in that world for doubt. The barracks loomed ahead, wooden and plain. As Yuko stepped inside, her foot caught on a jagged nail half pulled from the floor. She stumbled forward, the fabric of her dress tearing with a sharp, violent sound that sliced through the quiet. She cried out before she could stop herself. The rip felt obscene, like exposure, like the first step toward humiliation. Her hands flew up instinctively, clutching the torn cloth to her body. She did not see the man approach at first, only heard the spurs, the faint metallic jingle that made her heart seize. "A cowboy," someone whispered later. At that moment, he was only a shape in her peripheral vision. Tall, broad-shouldered, dust clinging to his boots. When he reached for her, panic flooded her chest. She twisted away and screamed, her voice cracking under the weight of everything she had been taught to fear. "Please don't hurt me." The words came out broken, half-formed in a language he did not understand, but the terror needed no translation. The women around her froze. This was it, the moment they had all been warned about. Yuko squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the blow. It did not come. Instead, the fabric was pulled apart further, the tear widening under his hands. The shock was worse than pain. Her breath hitched, her vision blurring. She felt exposed, violated, certain this was the cruelty, delayed. Then she felt air on her skin, cool and oddly gentle, followed by pressure near her knee. She opened her eyes despite herself. The cowboy was crouched in front of her, not looming, not angry. His brow was furrowed, his attention fixed not on her body, but on the thin line of blood running down her leg. He had torn the dress open to see the wound, nothing more. From a worn satchel at his side, he pulled a clean cloth and dabbed carefully, as though she were fragile glass rather than an enemy. "Easy now," he murmured, voice low, almost apologetic. She did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. There was no hunger in it, no mockery, only concern. Yuko trembled, her hands still gripping the ruined fabric. The world tilted. This was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. Enemies did not kneel. They did not clean wounds. They did not look at her scraped knee with more interest than her exposed skin. The man wrapped the cloth around her leg with deliberate care, fingers rough but precise, trained by work rather than cruelty. Around them, the camp resumed its quiet motion. No one laughed. No one jeered. A guard glanced over, then away, as if this moment were ordinary. Yuko felt something inside her fracture, a soundless break more disorienting than the tear of cloth. The fear was still there, coiled tight in her chest, but now it had nowhere to land. The cruelty she had prepared for refused to appear. In its place stood a man with dust on his boots and kindness in his hands. When he finished, he gave a small nod, almost embarrassed, and stepped back. Yuko stood frozen, staring at the bandage bright against her skin. The torn dress hung open, irreparable. She realized with a strange clarity that it was not the fabric that mattered. Something far more carefully sewn had come undone. Before the camp, before the cowboy, before the clean bandage on her knee, there had been the hospital, half standing on the edge of Manila, a skeleton of what it once was. Yuko had slept in corners, treated wounds under oil lamps, and handed out morphine she no longer had. Her uniform was always stained, blood, sweat, ash. The war was collapsing in on itself, inch by inch, and with it, everything that once seemed certain. Patients came in waves, most beyond saving. Shell-shocked officers screamed through the night. Supplies ran out. The rations grew thinner. She remembered once boiling weeds in the courtyard just to make a broth for a dying soldier who had not spoken in 3 days. There was no glory, only endurance, only pain. Still, she clung to the only thing they had left, duty. She believed, as she'd been told since she was a girl, that her suffering was a noble contribution to the empire. The idea was hammered into her early, dressed in ritual and repetition. She'd watched films in training that showed American GIs stomping through villages, grinning with blood on their hands. Her instructors called the enemy beasts, barbaric, faithless, gluttonous. One told her that if she were ever taken alive, they'd use her body as entertainment before discarding her like trash. She believed it. They all did. It was safer than doubt. Even among the nurses, the shame of dishonor was not abstract. It lived in their silence, in the way they looked away when someone was captured, in the hushed gossip about a girl who'd returned after being taken prisoner in China. No one spoke to her after that. Her name vanished, not from records, but from memory. Yuko carried this weight every time she picked up a bandage, every time she stitched someone's flesh. Her own value, she thought, would be measured not by survival, but by loyalty. To be taken meant erasure. If not by the Americans, then by your own people. That was the truth she held on to the day the Americans breached the perimeter of the hospital grounds. It had been early morning. A gray light filtered through the cracked windows. She was rinsing a surgical tray in a tin basin when the ground trembled under distant fire. They were told to evacuate, but there was nowhere to go. The officers had vanished. The wounded moaned on stretchers lined wall to wall. When the first boots appeared in the corridor, leather, muddy, unfamiliar, Yuko froze. She hid first. In a closet, behind boxes. She held her breath until her lungs ached. Her heartbeat was thunder in her ears. She prayed not to be found. And when the door opened, she screamed before she even saw who it was. But it wasn't what she expected. The soldier, he couldn't have been more than 20, startled at her scream. He stepped back, rifle lowered. He didn't touch her. He didn't even speak. Another soldier came behind him and gestured toward the hall, toward the other nurses now being herded together. They were not cuffed. They were not stripped. One woman cried as she walked. Yuko walked in silence, her fists clenched, her jaw locked tight. She had expected to die. The alternative felt worse. Outside, the sun had risen. The air was thick with dust and smoke, and still, impossibly, birds were singing. She saw one woman collapse and be carried. Another was offered water. She refused. Yuko didn't understand what was happening. The Americans weren't smiling, but they weren't sneering either. They gave orders, but not with rage. It all felt too calm, too surreal. She expected to be struck for hesitating. She wasn't. As the women were lined up by a waiting truck, a medic pointed to her hands, still streaked with blood from the last man she'd tried to save. He offered her a damp cloth. She stared at it as if it were a weapon. He looked confused, then tucked it into her palm and walked away. That was the first moment the narrative cracked. Not shattered, but cracked, like thin ice underfoot. Later, in the back of the truck, as they drove away from the ruins, Yuko pressed the cloth to her face and breathed in its scent. It smelled like soap, like something impossibly far from war. Her hands trembled. She had not died. She had been taken. And though the shame wrapped around her like chains, somewhere deep beneath it, something colder stirred. The question she could not yet allow herself to ask. What if everything they told us was wrong? The thought echoed in Yuko's mind like a forbidden song as she sat on the edge of a wooden cot, hands still folded in her lap, eyes darting between shadows. The barracks were quiet. Too quiet. No screams, no barking orders, no sounds of punishment, only the occasional cough, a shifting body, the creak of boards underfoot. It unsettled her more than chaos would have. She had braced for violence, braced for humiliation, but what she found instead was routine. Her name had been taken, written carefully on a clipboard by a young American soldier who couldn't pronounce it properly. Yuko? He'd asked, pen hovering. She hadn't responded. He checked the spelling anyway and moved on without a frown. Around her, the other women stood still, waiting for the catch, the moment when the calm cracked open to reveal something monstrous beneath. It never came. Dinner was ladled from a metal pot into wide tin bowls. Stew. Real stew. She could see potatoes, carrots, meat. Steam rose into the evening air like incense from another world. She did not move at first. Hunger warred with pride. The woman beside her took a bowl and sniffed it suspiciously. Another hesitated, then sipped. When no screaming followed, others followed suit. Yuko's own bowl was warm in her hands. She brought it to her lips, slowly. The first taste nearly broke her. She had not eaten like this in months. Not since before the retreat. The salt, the oil, the weight of it in her stomach. It was overwhelming. Her body began to devour it before her mind could consent. She hated herself for that. The stew didn't taste like mercy. It tasted like betrayal. Afterwards, she was led to a bunk, a simple cot with a thin mattress and a blanket folded neatly at the end. Clean sheets, clean pillow. She pressed her fingers into the fabric, half expecting them to sink through an illusion. But it was real. The blanket smelled faintly of soap and starch, too clean, too soft. She remembered the last bed she had known, a straw mat under a broken window, with rats rustling in the dark. Someone near her laughed softly, like a hiccup. Another whispered a prayer. The women didn't know whether to cry or sleep or prepare for some late punishment. They whispered in low voices, asking the same question in a dozen ways. Why are they feeding us? What do they want? Yuko said nothing. She lay down slowly, her body resisting the comfort. The mattress felt indecent. Her skin twitched at its softness, as if comfort itself were an accusation. She turned toward the wall and pulled the blanket over her, trembling. But sleep didn't come. Shame pressed heavier than the wool on her chest. She stared at the wooden beams above, eyes wide open in the dark. The stew churned inside her, not from sickness, but from confusion. Her stomach was full, her body clean, her wounds wrapped, and still she felt as if something inside her had been undone. She thought of her mother back home, how she had bowed in silence. When Yuko left, offering no tears, only a tight nod of duty. Better to die than be taken, she had said once, quoting the words Yuko would later memorize, and now here she was, not dead, not tortured, just full, safe, warm. A lie, she thought. This must be a lie. But if it was, why had no one come to collect payment? She heard footsteps outside, a pair of guards talking in low voices, not yelling. One laughed, an easy, human sound. It pierced the quiet with strange intimacy. Yuko shut her eyes against it, trying to banish the warmth rising in her chest. Kindness could not be trusted, not from them. But the pillow cradled her head, and the blanket held her like arms that asked nothing in return. Somewhere beyond the wire, war still raged. But inside the barracks, something more dangerous had begun, the slow unraveling of fear. She lay awake and realized the most terrifying thing wasn't that the Americans had hurt her. It was that they hadn't. He appeared again the next morning, just as the sun broke above the compound fence. Hat pulled low, boots coated in dust, medical bag in one hand, silence in the other. Yuko saw him before he spoke. She had just finished folding her blanket, hands moving by instinct, while her mind drifted in that unsettled place between hunger and shame. When he approached, she stiffened. Her eyes dropped to the ground. Her body remembered the rip of her dress. Not the pain, there had been none, but the moment she thought it was the end. He tipped his hat and said, "Mornin', ma'am." His voice was a low drawl, words that stretched like sun-warmed leather. She didn't understand most of what he said, but she heard the word he always used, "Ma'am," not prisoner, not enemy, not girl, a title, one that made her feel more seen than safe. He motioned to her leg. The bandage needed changing. She didn't argue. She sat on the edge of the cot, dress tugged down carefully, and let him work. His hands were large, calloused, hands made for fence posts and reins, not for tending to wounds, but they moved with certainty. He unwrapped the bandage, dabbed the scrape clean with a cloth soaked in something sharp-smelling, and replaced it with a new strip. No wince, no word, only silence and the slow rhythm of care. She watched him from beneath her lashes. His face was tanned, weathered by sun rather than war. His uniform was clean but worn at the cuffs. He wore no rank Yuko could identify, only a small stitched patch that meant nothing to her. And yet he moved with a kind of quiet authority, Not over people, but over pain. He didn't flinch at blood. He didn't gawk. He worked like someone who had done this 100 times for people who mattered to him. That was what unsettled her most, the way he made it seem normal. He spoke again, gesturing to her knee. "Healing up nice?" Then, with a nod, he packed up his things and left. She didn't thank him. She couldn't. The words caught in her throat, stuck somewhere between defiance and disbelief. But long after he disappeared around the corner, she kept staring at the door. Throughout the day, she saw him around the camp. Once, he was teaching another guard how to splint a wrist. Another time, he sat on a bench near the supply hut, rolling a cigarette with fingers stained by iodine. He never spoke much. When he did, it was brief, unhurried. A woman near Yuko dropped her tray at lunch, and he helped her gather the spilled food without a word. She flinched when he touched her hand. He stepped back immediately, gave a small nod, and walked on. It was like that, always. A presence more than a man, not soft, not warm, just present, stoic but not cruel. And beneath that silence, something softer flickered, like warmth behind thick glass. Yuko didn't understand it. She didn't want to. But she couldn't stop watching him. At night, she found herself thinking of his hands, not the way they had torn her dress. She knew now it had been to find the wound, but the way they had wrapped the bandage. She thought of his voice saying "ma'am," and how that one word had wrapped around her identity like a thread pulling something loose. She hated the thoughts. They felt like betrayal, not of country, but of fear. Fear had kept her safe, had told her who to hate, how to survive. Now it was slipping inch by inch, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw him kneeling, not in dominance, but in care, and wondered if it was possible to be disarmed not by weapons, but by kindness. The scent arrived before the sun fully did, warm, buttery, unreal. Yuko was sitting on her cot, rubbing the stiffness from her legs, when it drifted through the barracks like a memory from someone else's life. She lifted her head slowly. Around her, the other women stilled. Noses twitched. Eyes widened. There were no words spoken, just the sharp collective silence of disbelief. Biscuits. She had never tasted one, but she had heard the word whispered among wounded American soldiers back at the field hospital. Buttermilk biscuits, gravy on top. At the time it had sounded decadent, absurd, a foreign luxury wrapped in vowels she barely understood. And now that very smell was creeping under the doorframe, curling around her like smoke. They were marched, quietly, without shoving or barking, toward the mess hall. The building was plain, wooden, the windows open to let the morning air in. Inside, trays were handed out. Metal cups were filled with coffee so strong it made Yuko's eyes sting. Eggs, real eggs, scrambled, a square of buttered bread, still warm, and the biscuit, golden, soft, steaming, like something pulled from a dream. The guards stood in line too. They sat at nearby tables eating the same food. No separation, no sneers, no privilege flaunted, just Americans, soldiers, guards, prisoners, all chewing the same breakfast in the same air. Yuko stared at her tray, unsure of what was more impossible, the food or the silence surrounding it. This wasn't a trap. It couldn't be. But it also couldn't be real. She bit into the biscuit. The outside flaked like dry snow. The inside was soft, rich, her mouth filled with butter and salt and warmth she hadn't known in years. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the eggs, her fork hesitant. Beside her another woman exhaled, almost a laugh, almost a sob. Yuko didn't cry, but the food made her eyes sting more than the coffee had. She remembered Manila, remembered the long line of civilians begging for rice at a warehouse door that never opened, mothers holding children too weak to stand, her own rations dwindling day by day. The idea that prisoners, enemy prisoners, could be eating like this while civilians starved felt like the world had inverted itself. And yet, here she was. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. Every bite she took felt like a betrayal of homeland, of honor, of suffering. But the hunger won. Her body didn't care about ideology. It craved salt, fat, comfort. And the Americans, for some reason she couldn't understand, were offering it freely. At the next table, one of the guards cracked a joke in English. The soldier beside him laughed, loud, open-mouthed. It wasn't a cruel sound. It was human, easy, the kind of laughter Yuko hadn't heard in years. That was what truly shook her. Kindness she could explain away as a trick, a performance. But laughter, that was different. That was not directed at her, not even meant for her ears. It was joy, born in spite of war, not because of it. And somehow that made it more dangerous. It made these men, these supposed monsters, seem real. She took another bite, then lowered her fork. Her stomach was full faster than expected. The tray, still half covered in food, felt like a monument to something shameful. She couldn't name it, but she felt its weight. As they were led back to the barracks, the sun warming the earth beneath their feet, Yuko felt her heart beat faster. Not from fear, but from confusion. Every day in this camp seemed designed not to punish, but to undo, to unmake the beliefs she had sworn to live and die by. And worst of all, it was working. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Yuko held it between her fingers as if it might burn her skin, the pencil resting unused on the wooden table before her. Around her, the barracks were unusually still. No one spoke. No one moved. The guards had passed the supplies down the line without ceremony, explaining in slow, careful gestures that the women could write home. Write home. Two words that did not belong together anymore. For a long moment, Yuko was certain she had misunderstood. Letters were a privilege, not a right. Letters were controlled, censored, weaponized. In her world, words traveled only when permitted, only when useful. She had been taught that prisoners vanished, that families were told nothing, that silence was the final punishment. And yet here was a blank page, unmarked, waiting. She stared at it until her vision blurred. Across the room, another woman began to cry softly, shoulders shaking as if she were trying to keep the sound from escaping. Someone else pressed the pencil to the page immediately, writing with frantic urgency, as though afraid the chance might be snatched away. Others froze, paralyzed, caught between longing and fear. To write meant hope. Hope was dangerous. Yuko's mind filled with images she had tried not to touch since her capture. Her mother's hands, thin and cracked from washing clothes in cold water. The small shrine in the corner of their home. The way her mother's eyes had followed her to the door the morning she left for service, saying nothing, knowing words were unnecessary. If she wrote now, what could she possibly say? I am alive felt insufficient. I am fed felt obscene. I am treated kindly felt like treason. Her pencil hovered. She thought of the cowboy medic, of his careful hands and quiet voice. She thought of the biscuits, the eggs, the laughter. She thought of the stew warming her stomach on the first night when she had expected pain. All of it collided with the stories she had been told, the lies she had carried like armor. To put any of that into words felt like tearing something else open. Hours passed. The light shifted across the floor. Still, Yuko did not write. When she finally did, it was not with confidence, but with surrender. She wrote one sentence, slowly, deliberately, each character placed as if it might be her last. "Mother, I am alive, and they are not what we were told." She stopped there. Her hand trembled. The words stared back at her, simple and devastating. Alive, not what we were told. In that sentence was a confession she had not intended to make, to her mother, to herself, to the country she still loved, even as it had betrayed her. The letter was not long, but it felt irreversible. She folded the paper carefully, as if neatness could soften its impact. When the guards collected the letters, Yuko watched them disappear into a canvas satchel. She wondered who would read them first. Censors, perhaps. Officers. Strangers. She wondered if her mother would ever see the words. If she did, whether she would believe them, or whether disbelief would be safer. That night, sleep came even more reluctantly than before. The act of writing had unsettled her more deeply than hunger or fear ever had. To survive was one thing. To speak of survival was another. Words made survival real. They gave it shape. In the days that followed, the camp buzzed with quiet aftermath. Women whispered about what they had written or refused to say anything at all. Some regretted every word. Others wished they had written more. A few tore up their drafts before turning them in, choosing silence over risk. Yuko said nothing, but something had shifted inside her. The letter had been a small rebellion, not loud, not defiant, but unmistakable. It had crossed a line she could not uncross. By writing the truth, even a fragment of it, she had admitted that the enemy was not the monster she had been promised. And that admission carried weight. She began to notice how often the Americans used names, how they knocked before entering the barracks, how they corrected each other when voices rose too sharply. These details pressed against her thoughts, reinforced by the act of having written them down, even if only indirectly. The letter had been a confession, but it was also a mirror. For the first time since her capture, Yuko understood that the war was no longer only outside the wire. It was inside her now, waged quietly between what she had believed and what she was living. And with every word written, every truth acknowledged, that internal battle edged closer to a reckoning she could no longer avoid. The next disruption came not with words, but with water. Hot water. It steamed through the wash-house like breath in winter, fogging the air, beating on bare skin, carrying away layers of dust and sweat Yuko had learned to ignore. The women stood stiffly at first, unsure how to receive it. Some flinched when the first drops hit their shoulders. Others cried out softly as if struck. Yuko closed her eyes and let the water run over her scalp, her neck, her back. It felt almost unbearable, not from pain, but from the intimacy of it. Cleanliness, she realized, was another form of care. When she stepped out, hair dripping, wrapped in a towel that smelled faintly of soap, she felt lighter in a way that frightened her, as if something essential had been rinsed away along with the grime. Shame clung harder than dirt ever had. She was drying her hair when she noticed the cowboy standing near the infirmary table, sorting supplies. He looked up when she approached, squinting slightly, studying her face with a kind of professional focus. He didn't smile. He never did. But his gaze lingered longer than usual. "Ma'am," he said, then paused. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small case. Plain, brown. He opened it and held it out to her. Inside were spectacles. She stared at them, uncomprehending. Glasses were rare even before the war. After years of shortages, they had become almost mythical. She had not known how much her vision had dulled until that moment. The world, she realized dimly, had been soft around the edges for a long time. He gestured gently. "Try 'em." She hesitated, then took them with careful hands. The frames were light, wire thin. When she put them on, the world snapped into focus with startling violence. Lines sharpened, colors deepened, faces emerged with detail she had forgotten existed. The grain of the wooden walls, the stitching on uniforms, the dust motes floating in the sunlight. She inhaled sharply. The cowboy watched her reaction, nodding once. "No one should live in a blur," he said simply. The words struck harder than any slogan she had ever been taught. She saw him clearly now, too, the faint scar near his jaw, the tiredness around his eyes. Not a monster, not a savior, just a man. And that realization unsettled her more than fear ever had. He was no longer a threat in her mind. He was something worse, a mirror. She removed the glasses slowly, then put them back on, as if testing whether the clarity would vanish. It didn't. The world remained sharp, unforgiving in its detail. She bowed instinctively, a gesture of gratitude she had been trained to offer superiors, not enemies. He looked embarrassed, waved it away, and turned back to his supplies. That night, music drifted through the camp. It was faint at first, a thin line of sound threading its way between barracks. "A harmonica," someone whispered. Yuko lay on her cot, glasses folded beside her, and listened. The tune was simple, unsteady, played without ceremony. It was not a march, not an anthem. It had no orders in it. It existed only to exist. She felt something tighten in her chest. In her world, music had been reserved for ceremony and command, drums for marching, songs for loyalty. Beauty had always served purpose. Here, the music served nothing at all. It was indulgent, personal, free. That, she realized, was its crime. The tune ended. Silence returned, but the echo lingered, pressing against the walls of her thoughts. She turned on her side and stared through the lenses at the darkened ceiling. The clarity was relentless. It showed her the truth she had been avoiding. She was changing, not suddenly, not completely, but irrevocably. The glasses had given her sight, but they had also taken something from her, the ability to pretend she did not see. The cowboy had not torn her dress to shame her. He had not fed her to weaken her. He had not given her glasses to control her. Each act had been ordinary to him, routine, human, and that was the most treacherous thing of all. Because if this was humanity, then the lies she had lived by could no longer survive. And once clarity enters a life, it does not leave quietly. Yuko sat in the dirt behind the barracks, her back pressed against the wood, her knees pulled tight to her chest. The sun was warm. The wind was soft. Somewhere nearby, a broom scratched rhythmically against concrete. These small sounds had become her world now, quiet, consistent, unnervingly kind. But inside her, nothing was quiet. The stillness around her had stirred something far louder within. Bushido had been her backbone. The warrior code she'd grown up revering didn't live in just soldiers. It lived in daughters, wives, nurses. It lived in shame, sacrifice, and silence. In surrender there was only disgrace. In survival there was only duty. And yet here she was, whole, fed, even respected. Her hair was clean, her wounds were healing, her belly was full, and that, somehow, was the greatest crisis of all. Every kindness cracked the armor she had worn since birth. Each morning she expected the illusion to break, for the Americans to show their true nature, for the food to be poisoned, the blankets taken, the names on the clipboard to turn into a list of punishment. But it never came. The guards were consistent in their indifference. The medic still nodded and said, "Ma'am." The cook still ladled stew into her bowl with the same portion he gave the women who had once shot at his own. Dignity, it turned out, wasn't a weapon here. It was a condition of life, and that terrified her. She thought of her family, of her mother boiling tree bark to make soup in the city's ruins, of her brother who had vanished into smoke on an island no one could name. What would they think of her now, eating biscuits, reading donated books, being handed fresh soap? Would they weep with relief? Or would they turn away, ashamed? Would they see her as a ghost who had survived dishonor instead of seeking death? The guilt settled in her stomach like a stone. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in aching colors, Yuko found herself sitting beside another woman from her unit, Ayaka, older, quiet, a mother before she had been a nurse. They didn't speak often. Silence was safer. But tonight, the weight between them needed words. "They feed us too much," Ayaka said suddenly, not looking at her. "I feel it in my bones, the softness." Yuko nodded slowly. "And the warmth, the blankets, the names they use. They don't hate us." That hung in the air like a truth neither wanted to touch. Then Ayaka turned, her voice low, broken but steady. "If they value our lives, why don't we?" The words landed like a stone thrown into a still pond. Yuko's breath caught. She had no answer, only the same question echoing in her chest. It was the first time someone had spoken aloud what she had felt for weeks. This wasn't just survival. It was a slow dismantling of the belief that only pain held honor, that to be treated well was a sign of weakness, that to live with dignity outside of victory was a contradiction. The Americans weren't trying to convert them. They weren't preaching. They weren't even asking for forgiveness. They were simply behaving as though their enemy's life still had value, and that was rewriting everything. Yuko rose slowly and walked back to her cot, her mind thick with thought. The glasses were still folded beneath her pillow. The letter was gone, carried somewhere beyond the fence. Her body was stronger now. Her heart beat slower. Her hands no longer shook when she slept, but her soul was in chaos. She didn't know what she believed anymore, only that what she once believed was crumbling. Like this story so far? Please tap the like button and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. The war ended with a whisper, not a roar. A radio broadcast, a white flag, a sudden stillness that was more terrifying than the gunfire had ever been. There were no parades in the camp, no celebrations, only final orders, papers to sign, blankets returned. And then, one morning, they were told, "You're going home." Yuko stood on the deck of a transport ship as it pulled away from the Philippine coast, the wind cold against her cheeks. In her arms, she carried 3 things: the thin wool blanket she had wrapped herself in since her first night in the camp, the letter her mother had somehow sent back, creased, stained, but legible, and the glasses. She wore them now, though the world they revealed had changed again. The journey took weeks. She said little. The other women kept to themselves, their silence a shield. Some wept. Some stared at the sea. Some still refused to eat American food, clinging to the last thread of control they had. Yuko ate without apology. She no longer believed that dignity lived in hunger. When the ship docked in Yokosuka, the sky was gray with smoke. Bomb craters marked the roads like open wounds. Entire neighborhoods had vanished, reduced to piles of ash and broken stone. Children with swollen bellies and hollow eyes wandered barefoot through ruins. Yuko stepped off the ship and tasted grief in the air. This was the homeland she had defended. This was what remained. No one waited for her at the docks. The government had no welcome prepared. The military offered no medals. For the women, There were no debriefings, no ceremonies, just ration lines and narrow alleys, suspicious glances and muttered words. They were not hailed as survivors. They were watched, judged, doubted. The world had changed while they were away, and in their absence, silence had turned into suspicion. Yuko returned to her mother's village, walking the last miles on foot. The house was smaller than she remembered, the garden overgrown. Her mother opened the door slowly, as if afraid of ghosts. They embraced without words. At first, Yuko tried to explain. She told her mother about the camp, the food, the guards, the cowboy who had once torn her dress only to save her from infection, but the words fell flat. Her mother nodded, eyes lowered. She never asked again. It was easier that way. Silence was safer. The village was polite, but distant, the other women whispered. Some crossed the street when Yuko passed. A few called her Yojinbo, the word used for those who had consorted with the enemy. She said nothing. She did not deny, but neither did she confess. At night, she kept the glasses beside her futon. She did not wear them in public anymore. They were a relic now, a bridge to a world no one around her wanted to acknowledge. But in private, when the sky was clear, she would slip them on and look up at the stars. She thought of the cowboy sometimes, of the way he had said ma'am like it was a title, not an insult. She remembered how he'd handed her the glasses without fanfare. No one should live in a blur. She never learned his name, but she remembered the steadiness of his hands, the quiet dignity of his presence. She never wrote another letter, but she kept the first one tucked inside the sleeve of her old uniform. The ink had faded, the paper had yellowed. Still, the words remained. Mother, I am alive. And they are not what we were told. It was not a defense. It was not an apology. It was the truth. And even if no one else would speak it, she would carry it, quietly, steadily, as clear as the stars through polished glass. The dress lay folded in the bottom drawer of a cedar chest, wrapped in soft cloth, untouched by moth or mold. Yuko had stitched it back together herself, long after the war, long after the silence had become routine. The cotton was thin now, yellowed in places, the seams tight with careful repair. The tear down the front was nearly invisible to anyone else's eye, but she could see it. She could feel it, not as a wound, but as a mark of change. She had kept it not as a token of shame, but as a remembrance of the moment her world split, not from violence, but from unexpected mercy. That day in the camp infirmary had become a point of gravity in her memory. The cowboy's hands had not lingered. They had worked swiftly, purposefully. He had torn the dress not to humiliate her, but to reach the infection blooming beneath. He'd spoken only once. "Sorry, ma'am." Then he'd cleaned the wound with water that stung but did not scald. And in that moment, when she expected pain, he gave care instead. She didn't know it then, but that moment had begun the unraveling. The first fracture in the wall she had built from training and terror. She had sewn the dress that night by hand, trembling in the lamplight, not to preserve it, but to preserve herself. Because the dress no longer meant dishonor, it meant that someone had seen her suffering and responded not with triumph, but tenderness. That someone had crossed a line she didn't know could be crossed, not as a soldier, not as a victor, but as a fellow human being. The years moved on, but the feeling never left. Dignity, once tasted, cannot be unremembered. It stains the soul in a way that uniforms and flags never could. In the decades that followed, Yuko never again saw the cowboy. She never learned his story. Perhaps he returned to a ranch in Texas. Perhaps he became a father. Perhaps he never once thought about the torn dress or the woman who flinched under his touch that day. But she thought of him often, not with longing, not with confusion, with gratitude. He had done what her own people could not, made her feel worth saving. In post-war Japan, there was little room for stories like hers. People preferred the narrative of sacrifice, of martyrdom, of pride unbent. Her silence was not cowardice, it was a kindness. She told no one about the biscuits, about the harmonica music in the dark, about the soft pillow that caught her tears when she could no longer hold them in. But at night, when she sat beside the window and watched the stars, she remembered, and she repeated the words that had come to define the fracture that never fully healed. I did not surrender that day. She rested her hand on the dress in the drawer, its fabric worn but whole. I was saved. There was a difference, and she had come to understand it. Saving required another's choice. Surrender was hers, and that day she had not chosen to give up. He had chosen to offer kindness, and that had changed everything. The war lived on in books and monuments, in parades and graves, but Yuko knew that the real war, the one that mattered, was fought in hearts, in moments of doubt, in the impossible choice between belief and truth. Her life became quiet, but never hollow. She carried her memories like artifacts, not weights, the glasses, the letter, the dress, each a part of a revolution she had never asked for, each a reminder that even in war, not all wounds bleed, and not all heroes wear the flag we expect. Did this story move you? Please like the video and leave a comment below with your thoughts, and let us know where you're watching from. Every comment helps more people hear stories history forgot.